What's up, everybody? Excited to be here today doing a Draw My Life video. This is something that I tried to do back when I was still in Nicaragua, but ultimately I didn't end up following through, but I did do a lot of thought about it, and so here we go. Alright. It started with my parents. My parents were teachers. They traveled. Both of them were what one would refer to back in the day as an expatriate. And an expatriate, someone who used to live in their own country, but has since left and traveled. And this is really fascinating because there's a lot of parallels to my current lifestyle. Like, my father I have letters from him talking about living in Sri Lanka and how the cost of living is crazy and how he can have a gardener and a whole bunch of other stuff, get custom furniture for just much cheaper. And it's amazing how that is a recurring theme in my life. And this is way later, right? But my parents met in Colombo, Sri Lanka. They were both working for the International School of Colombo. And my dad was actually my mom's boss. Woo! But they met. I guess stuff happened, and they got married and had me a year later, I guess. That was 2 years after they left. And so at that point, we were in Sri Lanka, right? I have no memories of this because it was only a year. Then after that, we moved to Lesotho, Africa. And Africa was cool because this is where I made my first friend, and her name was Malaika. I remember because she lived behind us, and we would play in the yard and stuff. And I used to take sticks and put them in the sewage system and flush the toilet because eventually the sewage system would overflow. And my little 5-year-old mind loved this. It was amazed, you know. So we lived there for a while, and then we actually moved to Saudi Arabia because, again, my parents were international teachers, so they would teach for the international schools, right? So at this point, noticeable things. I mean, I'm getting exposed to a lot of different cultures, right? But I'm a little kid. I don't know that. I don't understand why that matters. I'm just oh, I move a lot. I don't have any friends. So I, at the time, I don't know what I did. I was really young. I didn't really do much. But back then, I was special education. I wasn't learning how to read as young as I should be to learn how to read. I was supposed to know how to read, and I didn't. And that was I didn't learn how to read until 2 or 3 years later. And it was actually the Harry Potter books. They completely altered my perception of reading and incentivized me to want to read because my father would read books to me every night, right? He would read me a bedtime story. And I felt like I wanted to know what was happening sooner than the next time my dad would read a book to me. And I was actively very interested in the Harry Potter story, so that was what got me into reading. And it was very interesting at this point, because prior to that, I was dumb. I just didn't apply myself. I didn't want to learn how to read, and I wasn't trying to. But then I went all in. My little kid mind was Harry Potter's awesome. There's other books, and there's dragons, and mythology, and all sorts of crazy, amazing, awesome stuff. And I went ham. I got to a point where I was reading 3 books a week, and they were all about mythology and dragons and magic and fantasy worlds that. Oh man, I freaking loved that, right? And this is before video games, because at this point, all I did was really read books, and that was it. And so that's it all started in Saudi Arabia, right? But then 9/11 happened, some other stuff happened, and we moved back to Maryland. Or not back to Maryland, but we had a summer house we were staying in. And then we moved to Maryland, right? And in Maryland, well, all I did was read books. This is also where I started playing video games. This is nothing major has really happened in my life aside from at this point. I've traveled a lot. I feel really lonely because I'm moving all the time. So I just deal with that by just playing or reading books all the time, constantly. When I'm hanging out with people, when I'm at family events, reading all the books and just getting lost in those worlds. That was how I dealt with life back then, right? And then it was in Maryland that this actually started to change because I discovered video games and I played Ocarina of Time, and it just altered my life. It was, oh my God. I remember being in that forest and seeing there were these little like fairies that were floating around, and the music, it was just like, what is this? Why is this so awesome? This is amazing. I love this. I feel so explorative. I can't stop playing. I was just like, oh man, I just fell in love. And that was the first time that I really, really enjoyed a video game. And this kind of marks a turning point, because now after that experience, I started to play more video games and read less books, to the point where after like a year, I completely stopped reading. And it wasn't for like 7 more years until I picked up a book again, which is kind of crazy. But from that point, video games that was how I dealt with stuff, right? All right, that's what like how I hung out with people. I didn't actually hang out. I didn't have friends. I just played video games. That was like what I did. I didn't really stay in places long enough. So then we get into the first trauma of my life. And this is when we moved from Maryland to Virginia. And at this point, I'm like 10 or 11, something like that. And I'm starting to want to have friends. Like, I'm not as interested in video games. I can't just play a video game and just have an amazing time all day. Like, I actually want to interact with people, and I start to feel lonely, and I start to realize that, like, I don't have friends. Everyone else has friends. Why is that? Like, what is wrong with me? Like, why is that a thing? And in general, I just felt very alienated. I was always a foreigner in every country I've been in. I'm always a foreigner. I'm not from one country, and this is where I started to feel quite lonely, right? But we moved into Virginia, and at this point, my father got really sick. I remember because we got a hotel in Fredericksburg right before we moved into the house, and at this point, I didn't know what was going on, but I remember my father was coughing a lot, and it sounded bad. Like, I mean, I didn't pay a lot of attention to stuff, but I would get worried and ask him what's wrong and if he's okay. And then that was all I really remember about that. But then a couple months later, once we'd moved into the house, there was a point where I looked into the toilet and it was just filled with blood. And I didn't know. I didn't say anything about it. I didn't know. I just saw. I knew like periods were a thing. I didn't know if that was like my mom. I don't know. But that was the first time I kind of noticed that something was wrong, right? And so at some point after that, I don't know when, the phone rang, and I was like, oh, I always pick up the phone and then ask who it is, and they ask for like my parents, and then I like tell them and give them the phone. That was how it worked, right? But something was just different this time. I was always a really well-behaved kid. I never went against the rules. Like, that just wasn't me. I didn't do that, but something about that moment, I decided that I was going to stay on that call and I was going to listen. And it was a doctor, and the doctor was talking about cancer, and he was talking about my father, and I realized that my father had lung cancer, and that was what the call was about. That was what the doctor was talking about, and I hung up. My mom must have heard, because like 3 minutes later, she came downstairs and she told me that he'd been diagnosed, and they just didn't know how to tell me. They weren't sure yet, and it would only been a couple weeks ago. So I understand, you know. But man, talk about a memorable moment, right? And from this point on, things got pretty rough. My father was on treatment for lung cancer for almost 2 years. And to be honest with you, it wasn't worth it. It didn't increase the quality of his life. And he died. And my mother went $100,000 into debt. The treatment wasn't worth it. It didn't help. All it did was keep him alive and struggling. But he wasn't really alive. I remember slowly, as a kid, like, you know, your parents try and hide a lot of stuff from you. They just want you to be happy and that kind of thing. But, like, it got to a point, I think it was after, like, a year of treatment, my father, he had the serious tone to himself, right? And he asked me to come out back with him. And wow, sorry. And he told me that he was gonna die. He looked me in the eye and said, like, look, Jack, I can't do this to you. I can't tell you that it's gonna be okay. I can't try and convince you that everything's gonna be happy. Like, I'm gonna die. And at the point, I didn't really think that. I hadn't realized that he was gonna die. I didn't know that was gonna happen. And I was scared. I was so scared. And honestly, that wasn't the saddest part. The saddest moment that I remember was after that, because the cancer metastasized, and it spread to his brain, and his behavior started changing a lot, right? He started to be unable to perform like really basic tasks. And he used to love cooking. Like, he would cook all the time. Like, growing up, my dad was the stay-at-home dad. Like, my mom was the one who worked a lot, and my dad was the one who spent a lot of time with me, and who would like cook. He was the one who would cook more regularly. And there was a point where he was trying to make pancakes, or crepes, like French pancakes, which is something he would make like every weekend, I remember. And it was great because I got to eat like sugary stuff for breakfast. I really loved it. And there was a point where he was trying to, he was trying to make crepes for me to like cheer me up and make me happy. But he just couldn't do it anymore. Like, he couldn't perform the basic tasks necessary to cook pancakes. Like, he was trying to cook, and he was using the wrong ingredients, and things were burning. And he just poured the batter into the pan, and then just started crying. And that was the saddest moment of my entire life, was just seeing my father and knowing that he knows that he's gonna die. And him being like trying to do something positive for his son anyway, just like trying to do the best with what he has anyway, and then not being able to. That was the hardest thing I've ever seen in my whole life. And I will always remember that moment, because ultimately that was the turning point for me. That is when I understood that he was going to die. And after that, a month or two later, he had a seizure. And I remember, because I don't remember much about my life at this point, because I was just drowning myself in video games. I was playing like RuneScape and World of Warcraft, and I just didn't know how to deal with anything. I didn't know how to deal with life. I just wanted to get away and just be in these other worlds. And a part of me hates myself for that, because my father was in a hospital, and he was often alone, and his son didn't want to visit him. And I think about that now, and I think about how lonely he must have felt sometimes to see that his son wasn't interested in spending time with him as he was dying. And that is something that I have remembered ever since, because I will not ever let that happen again. I will never let somebody I care about spend time with them. It's so important. You don't know what's going to happen to the people you love. You have no idea. Just because everything's been great for 10 years doesn't mean anything. You can literally wake up tomorrow and somebody you care about is dead. They're gone and they're never coming back. You cannot live your life in any way other than to focus on these people, to spend time with them, to love for them, to care for them, to be in their presence. This is the only thing that actually matters in life. It's people. And this event, in this early point in my childhood, really completely altered my life. Obviously, like, right? But so he had a seizure. He walked up to me, and then he was like, "Oh, I'm Jack. I'm having trouble with my 8. I'm having trouble with my 8." And I was like, "What? I don't know what that means. I don't understand." And then he fell to the ground, and he just started shaking and shaking. And I didn't know what to do, and then my mom ran over, and then she told me to call 911, so I did, and then they came, and they picked him up, and that was the point where, at this point, he was pretty much gone. He just, he was in and out of the hospital, and he would sit in his chair and rock back and forth, and just watch TV.
and he couldn't really talk much anymore. And then he became bedridden. And he had an oxygen tank. And I remember this because I would be playing RuneScape upstairs, and I could hear the, like... And I remember hearing that and just hearing how much pain he was in. And I just wanted him to die. Not because I didn't like him, or not because I wanted him to be, like, hurt, just because he was in so much pain. He wasn't a person anymore. And it was obvious, like, he wasn't gonna get better, you know? I just wanted him to not be in pain anymore. And there were times where I thought about, like, unplugging stuff, because, like, it was terrifying. And hearing that noise all the time, it was haunting. Like, just knowing every breath is closer to his last breath, and he's going to die, and he is in pain, and feels lonely, and he's just like knowing all of that about my favorite person in the world, my hero. I didn't know how to handle it. I really had no idea. About 2 months later, my aunt, or my father's sister, came to visit from England because, well, yeah, it was very obvious that he wasn't going to live much longer. So you should see the people before they die, you know, because it's the last time you're ever going to get to actually see them. So she came by, and oh man, I was sleeping on the couch, and my mom woke me up, and it was really early in the morning, and I knew straight away. I didn't even hear her words. I just knew he was dead. And so I got up, and then I walked into the room that he was in with his tank, and he wasn't breathing. But that was okay. Like that. Honestly, I was so happy to see that. I gave him a hug, and I knew that he wasn't in pain anymore. He wasn't dying, you know, like, he was dead, and he wasn't suffering anymore, and it was okay. And finally, like, I saw his face, and it wasn't pain. And I gave him a hug, and I was happy. I was happy that my father was dead. Because the past year had been it was so painful. It was a relief. A very complicated relief. So that was the first trauma in my life. And obviously that completely changed pretty much everything. After this, I found that I was really, like, I was way, I don't know. I just completely lost faith in everything that anybody told me about what actually matters in life. Because I saw these people, like, living these long out lives and then just dying of cancer as if cancer is just a thing that happens to people. And it's like, no, you get it because of the way that you live. Like, if you smoke and if you're around carcinogens and if you eat for shit, you die. Like, I hate that everyone acts like that's normal. It's not fucking normal. Like, you know? And I hated that all these people around me were talking to me about, like, the things I need to do in life as if it was all gonna lead to something good. And it was just, like, very obvious to me that my dad had just died and my mother was $100,000 in debt because we didn't have insurance. And, like, it was fucked. And if I just listened to all these people, then I would just end up like that. And there was no way that I was gonna let that happen. Absolutely no way. But I was really depressed now, and I started to focus on people. And for the first time in my life, I met this group of people about 6 months after my father died. And it was amazing. Like, I loved it. It was, I felt like I had friends. I had a bit of a family again. And I started to feel like I was part of something. And it was amazing. And then we moved. Because we were living in Fredericksburg at the time, and my mom wanted to be closer to work, because she was commuting a lot, and she wanted me to be able to go to a place where she where I can get like some kind of international diploma or the IB program, International Baccalaureate or whatever it is, right? She really liked IB and wanted me to be able to get IB schooling, so we moved. And this begins the hardest, most intense depression I've ever faced in my life. Because I had just lost my father, but that hadn't really kicked in yet. Because he had been so sick that honestly, like, him dying was more of a relief, because it's like life is relative. It's not based on everything. It's based on the past year, what situation you were in and what you're in now, right? But then I left all these friends, and then again, for another time, I was a new person around a bunch of people I don't know, and I'm a foreigner again, and people aren't like me, and I was so lonely, honestly. And my mom she was suicidal because she just lost her husband, and she was in debt because of like medicine that didn't help. It didn't do anything. He just stayed alive longer and then died. It was so painful. And she paid $100,000 for that experience. Imagine paying $100,000 for the love of your life to be slowly tortured and killed in front of you for 2 years. It was horrible. And I cannot blame her in any way for being depressed. That makes sense. And I understood. But it meant, you know, like, I'd gone through stuff too, and I was just a kid, you know? It was a really hard point in my life. I was really, really alone. And I think that's the only point that I ever, like, actually thought about killing myself. Because in general, I'm really happy, honestly. Like, I think because I went through all these things, it just taught me how fucking amazing it is to be alive. And, like, you gotta take advantage of it while you have it, because you're gonna die. So, you know, live your life well, right? But it was hard. It was definitely really hard. But over time, got out of it and got better. And honestly, then I go into a phase of my life I call, like, acceptance. And this is where I start to understand, like, okay, I'm different than people, but there are other people in the world who are weird. I start to understand now that it's not that I hate people. It's not that I'm an introvert. It's that I don't know people who I really relate to. And I learned this by meeting people who were weird and who had been through trauma and like, interacting with them and learning that it's all about the people you're around, you know? That was where that started to happen. And I started to feel like I had a group of people in Reston. And again, I felt like I was part of some kind of family, right? And that was great.